A prestigious hospital, an ambitious nurse, and a dark truth waiting to be exposed. At St. Mary's General Hospital, a place revered as a beacon of modern medicine, lies a secret no one dares to speak of. Not everyone in a white coat is a healer. Not everyone is treated equally. Angela Parker, a talented and determined nurse, walks through the hospital doors with dreams of making a name for herself. But she has no idea she's about to step into an uneven battleground, a war without bullets, but filled with condescending glances, whispered cruelty, and obstacles deliberately placed in her path to make her fail. But what they don't know is that someone is watching. From his hospital bed, a middle-aged man quietly observes. Thomas Edwards, with both arms in casts after a skiing accident, appears to be just another patient. But every glance, every gesture, every hushed conversation he overhears is forming a much bigger picture. Because he's not just a patient, he's a man with the power to change this hospital forever. And in just a few days, Angela Parker's name will be at the center of the biggest storm in St. Mary's history. Will she be crushed under the weight of the system, or will she rise and turn the tables? What hidden truths are waiting to come to light? And most importantly, who really holds the power? Stay tuned for the full story to uncover the shocking secret behind the pristine white walls of St. Mary's. If you love gripping, emotional stories with deep lessons about justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on what's coming next. Are you ready to take this journey with us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. St. Mary's General Hospital stood tall in the heart of the city, a beacon of modern medicine where the finest doctors gathered and cutting-edge technology was seamlessly integrated into every surgery and treatment. From the outside, the hospital exuded prestige and professionalism. Gleaming glass walls reflecting the morning sun, neatly trimmed rows of trees lining the entrance, and polished plaques showcasing the institution's groundbreaking medical achievements. But beneath that pristine facade, there were things no one dared to speak of. Inside, the air carried the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic. Wide hallways stretched endlessly, their polished floors reflecting the cold fluorescence above. Medical staff moved with precision, swift yet disciplined, maintaining the unrelenting rhythm of the hospital's daily operations. On the surface, everything appeared ideal. But if one looked closer, something else lurked beneath the seamless efficiency. A presence unseen, an unspoken weight threading through each step, each glance, each hushed conversation. Behind the stark white walls, it was a quiet, suffocating tension, not from the temperature, but from invisible barriers dividing people from one another. Angela Parker stepped through the grand entrance of St. Mary's, her heart pounding with both excitement and apprehension. Today was her first day at this prestigious institution, a position she had fought for, outshining hundreds of candidates to earn her place. She was proud of how far she had come, the long nights of relentless studying, the grueling hours of hands-on training, the sheer determination that had brought her here. But the initial thrill of achievement was quickly eclipsed by something else, an unease subtle but undeniable, as if she had just stepped into a place where she didn't quite belong. She adjusted the name tag on her uniform, took a deep breath, and walked forward. Yet, from the moment she entered, a strange silence settled around her. No welcoming smiles, no curious glances acknowledging the new arrival. The people around her either failed to notice her or were making a deliberate effort not to. Something about it felt off. Angela had experienced this before, but she had hoped St. Mary's would be different, that here she could simply focus on doing the job she loved without worrying about the invisible obstacles she had faced in the past. As she moved through the main lobby, she observed clusters of doctors and nurses engaged in casual conversation, laughter blending with professional discussions. But as she drew close, there was a shift so brief it might have gone unnoticed. A few glances flickered in her direction, lingering for half a second too long before darting away. The conversations continued, but the volume dipped slightly, as if her presence had interrupted a rhythm she wasn't a part of. Angela tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, steadying herself. This was just first-day nerves. Things would improve once she officially started working. She had to stay focused. This was where she had chosen to be, where she had fought to belong, and she wouldn't let anything shake her resolve. Yet deep down, a quiet sense of unease gnawed at her. She knew that ahead of her lay more than just long shifts and demanding patience. Something bigger, something far more challenging, awaited her within the cold, unyielding walls of St. Mary's General Hospital. Angela approached the nurse's station, feeling her heartbeat quicken slightly. She wasn't the type to get nervous easily, but there was something about the atmosphere in this hospital that unsettled her. She told herself it was probably just in her head. After all, this was a new environment, and feeling out of place at first was perfectly normal. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her name tag and spoke, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Good morning. I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse." A silence stretched a little longer than it should have. She had expected at least a polite nod, maybe even a welcoming smile, but none came. The nurses around her didn't stop what they were doing. One continued typing on the keyboard. Another flipped through a stack of papers as if she had never spoken. No one turned to look at her directly, yet Angela could feel the brief glances brushing past her, only to quickly dart away as if she weren't even there. After a few painfully long seconds, a blonde nurse finally lifted her gaze from the computer screen. Her pale blue eyes held no warmth, only a fleeting assessment as they flicked over Angela from head to toe. There was no open hostility in her expression, but there was no friendliness either. When she spoke, her voice was flat, mechanical. "Head nurse's office. Down the hall, third door on the right." That was it. No welcome, no small talk, no sign of acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum. Angela nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the sinking feeling in her chest. "Thank you." She turned away, trying to ignore the heavy silence that followed her departure. But it wasn't easy. From the very first moment, she had been made to feel like an outsider. The nurses hadn't needed to say it aloud. She already understood she was not one of them. She walked down the long hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the pristine white floor. The hospital around her functioned as any other. Medical staff moving briskly between rooms, doctors exchanging quiet conversations about patient conditions, worried families waiting anxiously in the chairs lining the corridor. But for Angela, the most noticeable thing was the silence of her colleagues. She didn't need to turn around to know they were watching her. No one openly stared, but she could sense the glances skimming over her before quickly looking away as she passed. It wasn't curiosity about the new hire. It was something else: weariness, caution, maybe even discomfort. Angela had felt this before, in other places, under different circumstances. She knew this feeling all too well. It was the feeling of stepping into a space where people believed she didn't belong. And just like before, she knew she would have to fight to prove otherwise. But even though she had prepared herself for this, she couldn't deny the sting of it. The hallway seemed endless, or maybe it just felt that way because of the weight pressing down on her. The patient rooms on either side each held a different story. Someone recovering from surgery, someone fighting a cruel disease, someone waiting for news that could change their life. Soon, she would be stepping into those rooms, doing everything in her power to help the people inside. But at this moment, she was still standing on the outside, looking in. Angela walked away from the nurse's station, trying to hold on to her confidence as she made her way down the hospital corridor. The unfamiliar stares, the conversations that seemed to pause as she passed, all made her feel out of place. But she reminded herself that she couldn't let any of it shake her resolve. She had worked too hard to be here. She kept moving toward the head nurse's office, following the directions she had been given. The hospital hallway was long and wide, illuminated by the steady glow of fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished white floors. Patient room doors remained closed, with only the occasional hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses breaking the stillness. Medical equipment hummed softly in the distance, a familiar sound in any hospital setting. Yet something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the tension of starting a new job. It was the eerie silence beneath the routine, as if she had stepped into a place where even the smallest misstep could lead to her immediate dismissal. Lost in thought, Angela stopped abruptly when a tall man emerged from a nearby patient room. He shut the door behind him with a firm click, and almost instantly, his gaze landed on her. She didn't need to read the name embroidered on his white coat to know who he was. This was Dr. William Greaves, the most powerful physician in the hospital. Dr. Greaves was tall, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and sharp, angular features that made him look as if he had been carved from stone. His gray eyes were piercing, scrutinizing her with the kind of detached precision that made it clear he was used to sizing people up in mere seconds. There was no warmth in his gaze, no curiosity, only an assessment, one that Angela didn't need to hear aloud to understand. He let his gaze flick over her from head to toe before finally speaking, his voice low and firm, carrying an unmistakable authority. I trust you're familiar with our protocols. We have very high standards here. I hope you can keep up. One sentence. That was all it took for Angela to grasp exactly what he was saying. This wasn't a greeting, it was a warning. She had heard of Dr. Greaves long before she arrived at St. Mary's. He wasn't just a brilliant surgeon. He was one of the most influential figures in the hospital's hierarchy, respected for his expertise, feared for his ruthless expectations. To him, this hospital was a well-oiled machine where there was no room for error and even less room for those who didn't belong. And judging by the way he spoke, he was already questioning whether she belonged here at all. Angela parted her lips, prepared to respond, but before she could say a word, Dr. Greaves turned and strode away, his white coat billowing slightly with each determined step. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't care what she had to say. For a few seconds, Angela remained frozen in place, feeling as if a gust of cold air had just passed through her. This wasn't just a routine encounter with a senior doctor. This was a test. She had stepped into a world controlled by those who made the rules, those who decided who stayed and who was cast out. And from the moment she arrived, it was clear she was not the kind of person they wanted here. But that didn't mean she would back down. Angela took a steady breath, tightened her grip on her bag, and resumed walking toward the head nurse's office. She knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, and she would be ready for them. From the very first days, Angela realized an undeniable truth. Work at this hospital was far from being distributed fairly. As she scanned the assignment board in the nurse's station, a heavy weight settled in her chest. Her name appeared over and over, listed next to the most complex cases, while her colleagues were given far lighter responsibilities. Some nurses had only 1 or 2 patients to monitor routine checkups, stable conditions, while she was assigned 5, sometimes 6, all requiring constant attention. The longest night shifts, the most difficult patients, the cases that required relentless monitoring, all of them seemed to fall on her shoulders, as if she were the only one expected to handle the worst of it. She glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else noticed the imbalance, but no one spoke. Some even avoided her gaze, as if afraid that lingering too long might drag them into the exhausting rotation she had been forced into. Her first official shift began with the kind of chaos that left no room for hesitation. An elderly patient in the recovery ward had suddenly gone into respiratory distress, setting off alarms throughout the hall. Angela was called in immediately, rushing to the room where a team of doctors and nurses were fighting to stabilize him. His breaths were ragged, his blood pressure plummeting, and his body convulsed uncontrollably. Without missing a beat, she took orders from the attending physician, her hands moving swiftly to prepare the intubation equipment, her sharp eyes locked onto every change in his condition. Sweat dampened her forehead, but she couldn't allow herself even a moment of distraction. One wrong move could tip him past the point of saving. When his breathing finally steadied, when the storm inside that room had passed, Angela exhaled deeply, realizing just how tense her own body had become under the weight of responsibility. But there was no time to recover. The moment she stepped out of the emergency unit, another nurse rushed toward her. "Angela, can you handle the patient in room 212? He's getting agitated." Angela frowned, instantly recognizing the room number. Room 212 belonged to a young male patient recovering from brain surgery, known for being aggressive, uncooperative, and impossible to manage. Several nurses had tried and failed to handle him, each leaving his room frustrated or, in some cases, on the verge of tears. No one wanted to deal with him, and Angela knew exactly why they were asking her. Not because they believed she could do it better, but because they wanted to push her into the hardest situations to see how much she could take. She tightened her grip on her bag, saying nothing, only nodding before making her way toward room 212. The moment she entered, she was met with pure chaos. The patient was struggling against another nurse, his voice hoarse from shouting, "I told you, I don't want anyone touching me. Get out." His face was flushed with anger, his hands clenched tightly into the sheets, as if bracing himself for a fight. The nurse standing beside him looked defeated, turning to Angela with a look that was somewhere between desperation and relief, as if she had just been saved from a losing battle. Angela moved forward, slow and deliberate, making no sudden movements. She kept her distance, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Angela Parker. I'm your nurse. I'm not here to bother you, but I do need to check your surgical site to make sure there aren't any complications." The patient glared at her, his breath still uneven, his grip on the blanket unrelenting. She could tell he was on edge, ready to lash out again at the slightest provocation. But she didn't push. She simply waited. A long moment passed before he finally turned his face away, his body relaxing just enough for his voice to drop into a grudging mutter. "Just do it quickly." Angela stepped forward and carefully examined his incision site, her movements steady and controlled. There was no unnecessary chatter, no forcefulness, only quiet efficiency. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, the air no longer charged with hostility. When she finished, she took a step back and met his gaze, now weary rather than angry. "I know you don't want to be here," she said, keeping her tone measured. "But my job is to make sure you recover without complications. If something feels wrong, you can tell me. But I won't let you hurt yourself or anyone else." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and left the room, shutting the door softly behind her. Outside, the nurse who had been inside earlier stared at her, wide-eyed. "You're not afraid of him?" Angela shrugged. "He's not the first patient like that I've had." She walked away, but deep down, she knew this wasn't just another difficult assignment. This had been another test. They wanted to see if she would crack under the pressure, if she would falter, if she would break. And she knew this was only the beginning. Angela picked up the patient chart and looked down at the list. Her name appeared next to a particularly difficult case. Mr. Johnson, room 305, a name that many nurses had long avoided. Even before she met him, she had heard rumors from her colleagues. An older man, a former soldier with conservative views to the extreme. He was not shy about expressing his racism, and more than a few nurses had walked out of the room in tears or anger after confronting him. But today his shift belonged to her. She walked out of the nurse's station and toward the inpatient hallway. Her footsteps echoed in the long, empty space, where the white light from the fluorescent lights fell on the polished tile, creating an oddly cold feeling. As she approached room 305, she paused for a second, taking a deep breath before placing her hand on the doorknob. She knew what she was facing, but she wouldn't back down. Angela stepped slowly into room 305, immediately sensing the tension in the air. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, filled with an unspoken hostility that had lingered in this room long before she entered. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor, an almost taunting reminder of the patient's presence. On the hospital bed sat an elderly man, his posture rigid, his expression hard as he fixed his scrutinizing gaze on her. The deep lines on his face spoke of age, but it wasn't the wrinkles or the silver hair that stood out most. It was the coldness in his eyes, a look Angela had seen before. She didn't even get a chance to speak before his voice cut through the air, raspy but laced with unmistakable contempt. "I don't want a black nurse touching me." The words hit the room like a slap. A suffocating silence followed, one that wasn't empty but loaded with prejudice, resentment, and the weight of a hatred that had been nurtured for decades. If it had been someone else, they might have walked out, or maybe they would have snapped back in anger. But Angela remained still, her face unreadable, her heartbeat steady. She had heard these words before. She knew this feeling all too well. But she wasn't just someone who had endured racism. She was a nurse, and her job was to provide care, no matter who stood in front of her or what they thought of her. "I'm here to take care of you, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet force that was impossible to ignore. "If you want to get better, I'll help. If you have a problem with that, I can inform the doctor and see if they can make other arrangements." She didn't need to say anything more. Angela knew that men like him wouldn't change their minds because of one conversation. She had no intention of wasting her energy trying to convince him otherwise. But she wouldn't back down, and she certainly wouldn't let anyone define her worth by the color of her skin. Mr. Johnson stared at her, his sharp eyes scanning her as if expecting her to flinch, to react, to let his words break her. But she didn't, and that bothered him more than he expected. He was used to people backing away, used to seeing anger flare up, used to people swallowing their pride and accommodating his prejudice. But Angela did none of that. She stood there, unwavering, waiting. Finally, after a long pause, he let out a curt, begrudging sigh. Just get it over with. Angela stepped forward, methodically checking his vitals, monitoring his heart rate, blood pressure, and the healing progress of his arm. She could feel his gaze still locked onto her, waiting for a mistake, for some flaw he could latch onto. But she didn't give him one. Her hands were steady, her movements precise, her focus unshaken. There was no hesitation, no fear, only quiet professionalism. She had nothing to prove to him, but she would never allow him to diminish her either. When she finished, she gave a brief nod. You're all set. If you feel any discomfort or notice anything unusual, press the call button. He didn't respond. She hadn't expected him to. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. But as it clicked shut behind her, a strange chill crept down her spine. Something felt off. There was another presence here, one that didn't belong to Mr. Johnson. From the shadows of the hallway, a man stood watching. He had been there the entire time, his sharp gaze dissecting every second of what had just transpired. He made no move to approach, nor did he look away when Angela stepped out of the room. His head tilted slightly, as if filing away every word, every reaction, every small detail of the exchange. Then, just barely, the corner of his mouth lifted, not in a smile, but in something more elusive, something calculating. Angela had no idea. She had just caught the attention of someone with far more influence than she realized. And this moment, this brief, tense encounter, was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever anticipated. In a VIP hospital room at St. Mary's, Thomas Edwards sat upright against the headboard, his sharp gaze fixed on the hallway beyond his door. Both of his arms were wrapped in thick casts after a severe skiing accident, yet there was nothing weak or helpless about his demeanor. If anything, there was an air of authority about him, a quiet but unmistakable presence that only those who had once commanded power could possess. No one in the hospital knew who he really was. To them, he was just another wealthy patient, fortunate enough to receive top-tier treatment. But in truth, Thomas Edwards was no ordinary patient. His presence at St. Mary's had been entirely unexpected, but the accident had given him a rare opportunity, one that allowed him to witness a side of the hospital that was never included in its awards, rankings, or glowing reports. He had seen the fleeting glances, the stilted conversations that abruptly ended the moment Angela Parker approached the nurse's station. He had watched the cold indifference that greeted her on her very first day. He had observed how her colleagues unfairly distributed the workload, burdening her with the longest shifts and the most difficult patients, as if their goal was to exhaust her into submission before she had even found her footing. But what intrigued him the most was her encounter with Dr. William Greaves. Thomas Edwards had spent a lifetime dealing with men like Greaves, men who wielded their authority with quiet arrogance, believing themselves to be the rulers of the small empires they controlled. He hadn't needed to hear every word exchanged between them to understand the doctor's true intentions. It was all there in the way he looked at Angela, the way he emphasized the hospital's high standards, the way he turned and walked away before she had the chance to respond, as if her presence was barely worth acknowledging. Dr. Greaves was the kind of man who believed power dictated worth, and from the way he had dismissed Angela, it was clear he had already decided she wasn't worthy. Thomas had watched Angela throughout her first shift. He had seen how she didn't flinch under the weight of the most grueling assignments, how she remained composed in the face of difficult patients, and most notably, how she handled Mr. Johnson. He had already observed room 305 more times than he cared to count. He had seen other nurses leave that room shaken, some holding back tears, others walking away in frustration. But Angela was different. She didn't lash out, didn't lose her composure, and most importantly, didn't allow herself to be diminished by a man who wanted nothing more than to make her feel small. A faint smirk crossed Thomas's lips as he recalled the way she had exited the room, her expression untouched by the patient's hostility. Not many could do that. Even fewer could endure what she had been subjected to on her first day and still stand tall. He recognized her type, those forced to be strong, those who carried more burdens than necessary just to have a seat at the table. What Angela didn't know was that she had caught the attention of someone far more powerful than she could have imagined, someone capable of shifting the balance of this entire hospital. Thomas Edwards was not just another anonymous patient, nor was he simply a wealthy man recovering from an accident. He was a man with influence, a man who could change the course of St. Mary's General Hospital if he chose to. And at this moment, he was watching, waiting to see just how far Angela Parker could go. Thomas Edwards was no ordinary patient. On the surface, he appeared to be just another wealthy, middle-aged man who had the misfortune of a skiing accident. Now confined to a hospital bed with both arms in casts, he had been placed in the VIP ward, a section reserved for those with status or financial means, where doctors and nurses treated him with the required level of respect, but without any real knowledge of who he was beyond the name on his patient file. However, if the name Thomas Edwards were spoken in the right circles, it could send shock waves through the entire hospital. He was not some anonymous businessman or a silent investor. He was the CEO of Healthcare United, the largest private healthcare conglomerate in the United States, overseeing hundreds of hospitals, clinics, and research centers across the country. Any medical institution seeking funding, expansion, or cutting-edge technology relied on Healthcare United's backing. A single nod from Thomas could transform a struggling facility into a premier medical center, just as easily as a quiet decision could push a renowned hospital toward financial ruin. But here at St. Mary's, no one knew. Not even the hospital's highest-ranking officials had any idea that the man recovering in room 412 was one of the most influential figures in the medical industry. And that anonymity gave Thomas a rare opportunity, one that allowed him to observe without being treated as a benefactor or a power broker. Here, he wasn't someone to impress or accommodate. At least, that's what they believed. His arrival at St. Mary's had been accidental, but Thomas never believed in coincidences. Every event, every unexpected turn in life, carried meaning. When he was brought into this hospital, when he saw the way it operated, when he witnessed how its staff treated one another, he knew he had stumbled upon something worth his attention. For years, he had evaluated hospitals through financial reports, patient statistics, and performance metrics. But numbers could only tell part of the story. First-hand experience, however, revealed the truths that data often concealed. And at St. Mary's, he had seen enough to know that this hospital was far from the shining beacon it claimed to be. For the first few days, he simply observed. He noticed how the medical staff's behavior shifted depending on a patient's perceived social status. He saw doctors who were cold and dismissive towards some colleagues, yet overly accommodating to others. He recognized a system where success wasn't always dictated by skill or dedication, but by politics, relationships, and invisible hierarchies. But the thing that caught his attention the most was Angela Parker. Before her arrival, Thomas knew nothing about her, but from the moment she stepped into the hospital, it became clear that she was not welcome. He had watched the indifference from the nurses when she introduced herself at the station. He had seen how she was assigned the hardest cases, forced into the most grueling shifts while others conveniently avoided those responsibilities. He had witnessed her tense encounter with Dr. Greaves, a conversation Thomas didn't need to hear in full to understand exactly what had transpired. Throughout his life, Thomas had encountered all types of people, those who thrived on merit, those who schemed their way to the top, and those who were crushed simply because they didn't fit the mold of those in power. He didn't need Greaves to explicitly say it. He could see it in the way the man looked at Angela, the way he emphasized the hospital's high standards, the way he dismissed her without even waiting for a response. Greaves had already decided that Angela didn't belong, but Angela's response fascinated him. She neither shrank back nor lashed out. She didn't beg for acceptance, nor did she let the unfairness of it all derail her. Instead, she endured, she adapted, and most importantly, she refused to be broken. He had seen her face one trial after another, her grueling assignments, her difficult patients, the blatant discrimination. But what solidified his interest was how she handled Mr. Johnson. Thomas had seen countless nurses walk into room 305 only to emerge shaken, some barely holding back tears. Others had simply abandoned the effort altogether. But Angela, she had walked in, faced the man's racism head-on, and remained unmoved. No anger, no fear, no submission, just quiet, unwavering resolve. People like her were rare, and they were worth watching. Still, Thomas wasn't one to make impulsive decisions. Major changes required patience. He was waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, one that would allow him to act without revealing his true identity too soon. He wanted to see how far Angela Parker could go, how much she could withstand, and whether St. Mary's was truly a hospital built on excellence or just another institution rotting beneath a polished surface. Because if what he suspected was true, one word from him could alter the fate of this hospital forever. That day, tension gripped St. Mary's General Hospital like a taut wire ready to snap. A critical surgery was about to take place, and only the hospital's most experienced medical professionals had been selected for the procedure. Standing among the team of doctors and nurses in the operating room, Angela forced herself to focus as the head anesthesiologist gave final instructions. But deep down, she knew today would be anything but routine. The patient was a middle-aged man with severe abdominal trauma from a car accident. A single mistake could mean death on the table. But the most concerning part wasn't the complexity of the surgery. It was the man leading it, Dr. William Greaves. From the moment he entered the room, Greaves carried himself with the air of a man who believed the world revolved around him. Beneath his sterile surgical gown, his piercing gaze swept across the room, briefly landing on Angela before moving on. She could feel the skepticism, the barely concealed disdain behind that look, but he said nothing to her. He simply took his place and signaled for the procedure to begin. Angela had worked in operating rooms before. She knew her role well, preparing instruments, assisting the lead surgeon, monitoring the patient's condition. But something felt off from the very start. The surgery progressed with intense concentration. The steady beep of the heart monitor echoed through the room, a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death truly was. Despite the low temperature maintained to prevent infection, beads of sweat dotted the foreheads of several nurses. No one spoke unnecessarily. Every movement, every decision had to be precise. Angela kept a close watch on Dr. Greaves. He worked quickly, but there was an unsettling haste in his movements. She recognized it immediately, the kind of overconfidence that could turn deadly. Then came the moment that made her blood run cold. Dr. Greaves was about to make an incision near a critical artery, but his angle was completely wrong. If his scalpel cut too deep, blood would flood the table, and the patient would die before anyone could react. No one else in the room noticed. The nurses were busy with equipment checks. The anesthesiologist focused on vitals. Everyone trusted Greaves implicitly. Angela knew she had a choice. Speaking up meant risking everything. She was just a new nurse. No one in this room expected her to challenge the lead surgeon, especially not William Greaves. But if she stayed silent, the patient would die. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She scanned the room, hoping someone else saw the danger, but no one reacted. They all believed in Greaves's expertise. And then, just as the scalpel was about to descend, Angela took a deep breath, summoned every ounce of courage, and said firmly, "Dr. Greaves, I think we should approach from a different angle." The words sliced through the tense silence of the operating room like a lightning strike. For a split second, everything froze. Greaves stopped mid-motion. The room was full, yet in that moment, only two people existed. Angela could see the storm brewing in his eyes. No one interrupted Greaves in surgery. No one questioned him. And now a new nurse, someone he had already dismissed as insignificant, had just dared to challenge him in front of everyone. His breath slowed, controlled. The scalpel in his hand remained motionless. The tension in the air was suffocating. Angela could hear the sound of sweat dripping from a nurse's forehead onto the sterile floor. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, dangerously cold, sending a chill down her spine. Angela knew she had just stepped into dangerous territory, but there was no going back. "I think we should approach from a different angle," she repeated, this time without hesitation. "Otherwise, there's a risk of damaging the main artery." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. A nearby nurse swallowed hard, staring at Angela like she had just committed an unthinkable act. Greaves didn't speak for a moment. Then he let out a sharp, humorless laugh, not one of amusement, but of pure contempt. "And you think you can teach me how to operate?" Angela felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she didn't waver. She met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not teaching anyone," she said steadily. "I just want to make sure the patient is safe." The operating room remained silent. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room had frozen in the moment Angela spoke up. Everyone knew she had done something no one else dared to do. She had openly challenged Dr. William Greaves in the middle of a high-risk surgery. Greaves's expression darkened, his scalpel hovering just above the patient. His mind was likely racing, but even he knew he couldn't simply dismiss Angela's warning without at least considering it. A mistake in this room wouldn't just cost him his reputation. It would cost a man his life. No one sided with her, but no one opposed her either. The other doctors stood motionless, some lowering their gaze, avoiding Greaves's eyes, as if even breathing too loudly might pull them into the storm that was about to erupt. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before Greaves took a slow breath, his voice low and cold. "You want me to adjust my approach?" Angela nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. There was only the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but a visible effort to suppress his rage. He adjusted the scalpel, shifting to the angle Angela had suggested, his hands steady as ever. Everyone in the room held their breath, and then the surgery resumed. Angela kept her focus, but she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her. They were all waiting to see if she was right. If she was wrong, she would never work in this hospital again. If she was right, she might still face consequences simply for speaking out. Greaves continued, and just as Angela had predicted, his initial incision would have been disastrous. Had he proceeded with his original trajectory, he would have severed the artery, and the patient likely wouldn't have survived. But now, with the new approach, there was significantly less blood loss, and the procedure became far easier to control. After an hour of painstaking precision, the surgery was complete. The patient lived, but Angela knew she had just waged a much bigger war. As the team removed their gloves and left the room, no one said a word to her. A few nurses stole quick glances, but they looked away just as quickly. No one dared to support her, but they also couldn't deny that she had been right. She had barely stepped out of the operating room when someone blocked her path. "Nurse Parker, the chief of surgery wants to see you immediately." She wasn't surprised. She knew this was coming. The office was small and eerily quiet, so silent that Angela could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Dr. Greaves stood near the desk, arms crossed over his chest, his glare colder than ever. Seated behind the desk was the department head, an older man with a practiced neutrality in his expression, though the tension in his posture betrayed his discomfort. Angela stood firm, preparing herself for what was about to happen. Greaves wasted no time. "Who do you think you are?" His voice was razor-sharp, each word slicing through the air like a blade. "You think you have the right to correct me in the middle of a critical operation?" Angela clenched her fist slightly, but refused to look away. "I wasn't trying to correct anyone. I was trying to keep the patient safe." "Patient safety?" Greaves let out a mocking laugh. "How long have you been here? A week? 2. And you think you can walk into my operating room and tell me how to perform a surgery I've done for decades?" The room felt smaller. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "You were only hired because this hospital needed more diversity," Greaves continued, his voice turning sharp with contempt. "Don't think that means you get to act like you belong at the same level as me." A chill spread through Angela's body, not because she was shocked, but because she had always known these thoughts existed. She just hadn't expected Greaves to say them so openly. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I wasn't hired because of diversity quotas," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I was hired because I'm qualified for this job, and I think today's surgery proves that." A flicker of anger crossed Greaves's face, but before he could respond, the office door swung open. All eyes turned toward the doorway. Thomas Edwards walked in, dressed in a dark suit. His movements were slow but carried a presence that filled the entire room. His piercing gaze landed on Greaves first, his expression unreadable but undeniably commanding. The air shifted instantly. Thomas let his eyes linger on Angela for a brief moment before turning back to Greaves. His voice, deep and composed, carried a weight that sent a clear message. "I happened to overhear this conversation," he said, "and I think you and I need to have a discussion, Dr. Greaves." A heavy silence fell over the room. Angela turned to Thomas, and in that moment, she realized he was not just another patient. Thomas Edwards was no ordinary patient. He wasn't just a wealthy, middle-aged man recovering from a skiing accident. confined to a hospital bed with both arms in casts. Thomas was the CEO of Healthcare United, the largest healthcare conglomerate in the United States, owning and operating hundreds of hospitals, clinics, and research centers nationwide. Healthcare United was not just a name in the healthcare industry. It was a powerful entity capable of shaping the policies and operations of countless medical facilities. Every decision Thomas made could change the trajectory of any hospital within its network, from transforming a struggling institution into a top-tier medical center to pushing a prestigious one toward bankruptcy. The staff at St. Mary's had no idea who he really was. They saw him as just another wealthy patient, fortunate enough to receive special treatment. But Thomas was far more than just a patient. He had come to St. Mary's not by accident, but for a reason only someone with his power and perspective could understand, to observe from the inside. No one treated him like a benefactor or a decision-maker. They treated him like any other patient, and that gave him a rare opportunity to see the true inner workings of the hospital without the usual facade of flattery or fear. Thomas had been at St. Mary's long enough to witness the subtle flaws that the hospital's polished reputation didn't reveal. He had seen the way staff interacted with patients based on their perceived social status. He had watched as colleagues, both doctors and nurses, treated each other with cold detachment or false friendliness, depending on the relationships they had. He saw a system where success wasn't always determined by skill or ethics, but by connections and the hierarchies people build around them. But what caught his attention the most was Angela Parker. From the moment she stepped into St. Mary's, Thomas noticed how she was treated differently. He had seen the indifference in the eyes of the nurses when she first approached the station. He had observed how she was assigned the hardest cases, forced to work the longest shifts while others were given far easier assignments. He had also witnessed the confrontation between her and Dr. Greaves, a conversation Thomas didn't need to overhear in its entirety to understand. Throughout his life, Thomas had met all kinds of people, those who rose by merit, those who climbed by manipulation, and those who were crushed simply because they didn't belong to the world of the powerful. He didn't need Greaves to spell it out for him. He could see it in the way the man looked at Angela, in the way he emphasized the hospital's high standards, in the way he brushed her aside without waiting for her response. Greaves had already decided that Angela didn't belong. But Angela wasn't like anyone Thomas had seen before. She didn't cower. She didn't try to please anyone. She didn't lose her composure when faced with unfairness. She simply stood her ground. Her response to the challenges thrown her way, how she maintained her composure in front of Greaves, how she dealt with difficult patients, especially Mr. Johnson, made Thomas watch her with increasing interest. Not everyone could keep their cool with a patient like Johnson. Thomas had seen nurses leave his room frustrated, some even close to tears. But Angela didn't flinch. She faced his racism head-on without backing down, but also without losing control. Thomas recognized that people like her were rare and worth observing. However, he wasn't in a hurry to act. Big changes didn't come from hasty decisions. He was waiting for the right moment, a time when he could make his move without revealing too much too soon. He wanted to see how far Angela Parker could go, how much she could endure, and whether St. Mary's was truly a place of excellence or just a facade hiding deeper flaws. Because if what he suspected was true, one word from him could change the fate of this hospital forever. As he watched Angela interact with the medical staff and handle the challenges in front of her, he knew something needed to be done, and soon the time would come. He was ready to make his move. The wheels were already in motion. Thomas glanced back at Angela, and for a moment, their eyes met. She had no idea that he was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, and that realization would change everything. "I think it's time for a change," Thomas said to the room, signaling a new era for St. Mary's, a new era that would start with him and would, whether Angela realized it or not, change everything she thought she knew about this hospital. Thomas Edwards ordered an immediate investigation, and Dr. Greaves was suspended on the spot. The room, once filled with tension, suddenly became eerily silent. No one dared to speak, their eyes fixed on Thomas, who stood in the center of the room like a figure of absolute authority. His gaze swept across everyone present, each individual feeling the weight of his unspoken judgment. In that moment, it was clear this wasn't just about one man's mistake. This was a moment of reckoning, a shift that would reverberate through the very foundations of the hospital. Angela stood frozen, struggling to process what had just happened. Dr. Greaves suspended? The very man who had ruled this hospital with his cold, arrogant demeanor for years was now facing the consequences of his own actions. And it all began with her. A decision, a single word from her, had turned the entire tide. The same Dr. Greaves who had dismissed her, belittled her, and made her feel insignificant was now being held accountable. It was a moment Angela had never anticipated, but one that was deeply empowering, yet overwhelmingly terrifying at the same time. The room remained still, almost too still, as the doctors and nurses who had been present during the surgery stood in shock. They were all witnessing something unprecedented. No one had ever dared to challenge Greaves in such a way. And yet here she was, Angela, a new nurse who had not only challenged him, but had forced the hospital to confront the possibility that its most powerful figure was, in fact, deeply flawed. She had been right, and the entire hospital had just been put on notice. But as much as Angela felt a sense of accomplishment, a quiet dread began to settle in her chest. What would the consequences be for her? What would she face now that the storm had passed? Would she be seen as a hero or a troublemaker? Thomas's voice cut through the silence, steady and commanding. The investigation will begin immediately. The words echoed in the room like a decree, and with them came an undeniable sense of finality. Everyone in the room had no choice but to listen. They knew that whatever came next would not only reshape Dr. Greaves's future, but would affect the entire culture of St. Mary's. Angela stood tall, trying to appear composed though her mind raced. She had never expected such a strong reaction from Thomas. She had only done what she thought was right, what she knew was necessary. But now, as she stood there under the heavy gaze of everyone in the room, she realized how far-reaching her actions had become. This was bigger than just one surgery. It was about the power dynamics within the entire hospital, and she had just set something in motion that could not be undone. The other doctors and nurses shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact, clearly unsure of how to respond. Some looked down at the floor, unwilling to make their allegiance known, while others simply stood in silence. No one dared to speak in favor of Angela, but equally, no one was willing to openly oppose her. It was as if the room was holding its breath, caught in the moment between what was and what was about to come. Angela felt the weight of their silent judgment, but she also felt the quiet recognition that her actions had forced them to confront a reality they had all ignored for too long. And then Thomas turned to Angela, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. For a split second, it felt as though time had slowed. She could sense the shift in his attitude, the way he was assessing her. She had taken a bold step, and it seemed that, in some way, Thomas was acknowledging that. The moment stretched out, and in the silence, she could almost hear her heartbeat thundering in her chest. "You did the right thing," Thomas said, his voice steady, but his words carrying a weight that went far beyond the immediate circumstances. "I will not let this be swept under the rug." His words were a quiet promise, one that resonated with Angela on a deep level. For the first time, she realized that her actions had mattered. She had made a difference. She had made them all take notice. The tension in the room began to ease, but Angela knew this was only the beginning. The decision to confront Greaves, to stand up for what was right, had already put her on a path of no return. She was now part of something much larger than herself, a shift in the very fabric of St. Mary's, and with that realization came a deep sense of both fear and exhilaration. An internal investigation was launched, and a series of discriminatory practices were exposed. The hospital, which had long prided itself on its reputation, was now facing the truth of its deep-seated biases. The investigation uncovered systematic favoritism, unjust treatment, and the very culture of exclusion that Angela had dared to challenge. The findings were undeniable, and the hospital leadership could no longer ignore the elephant in the room. As a result, Dr. Greaves was fired. His long-held position of power crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the public backlash that followed. It was a monumental shift for St. Mary's. No longer could the old regime of intimidation and unfair treatment reign over the institution. The atmosphere that had once been so thick with fear and favoritism began to loosen, giving way to a new era. And in the midst of this upheaval, Angela was appointed the new Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Her appointment was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a clear message that St. Mary's was ready for real change. It was a recognition of her courage, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to justice. But while this was a victory, Angela knew the real work was just beginning. She had fought to be heard, and now she had a platform to make real change. But it was a double-edged sword. The weight of the responsibility was immense, and the challenges she would face in her new role were far from easy. She was stepping into a position where every decision, every initiative, would be scrutinized, not just by the hospital staff, but by those who had supported the old system. But despite the challenges, Angela couldn't back down. She knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated. Not everyone was thrilled with the changes. Angela quickly learned that some people, those who had thrived under the previous system, weren't ready to embrace the transformation. The hospital was full of staff members who were resistant to change, unwilling to let go of their privileges. They viewed her appointment with skepticism, and some even saw it as a threat to the status quo. As the director of diversity and inclusion, Angela became the focal point of a movement that not everyone welcomed. There were those who tried to undermine her at every turn, questioning her authority, doubting her competence, and even sabotaging her efforts in subtle ways. The pressure was immense. She often found herself in meetings where her ideas were challenged, dismissed, or outright ignored. But each time, Angela reminded herself why she was there. She wasn't just fighting for a position of power. She was fighting for the future of St. Mary's, a future where equality, fairness, and respect would no longer be optional. The demands of her new role were overwhelming at times. She had to navigate the intricate politics of the hospital, balancing the needs of the staff, the administration, and the patients. She worked tirelessly to implement programs that would address the systemic issues of discrimination, inequality, and bias that had plagued the institution for years. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, failures, and countless moments when she doubted herself. But each success, no matter how small, reinforced her belief that change was possible. Angela knew that this battle wasn't just about her career or her ambitions. It was about creating a hospital that valued every individual, whether they were a patient or a staff member. It was about dismantling the walls of prejudice and building an environment where diversity was celebrated, not tolerated. She wasn't just changing the hospital's policies, she was reshaping its very culture. As the months passed, Angela began to see signs of progress. More staff members began to support her initiatives, and the once hostile environment started to shift. There were still challenges ahead, but Angela remained resolute. She knew the journey would be long, and the road would be difficult, but she was prepared for the fight. In the end, Angela wasn't just leading a revolution at St. Mary's. She was leading the charge for a new kind of healthcare, one where everyone had a voice and where fairness and justice were the foundation of everything the institution stood for. And this revolution, Angela knew, would echo far beyond the walls of St. Mary's. 1 year later, Angela stood before the packed auditorium of St. Mary's Hospital, facing hundreds of doctors, nurses, and staff members. The room was filled with anticipation, and the weight of the moment was not lost on her. A year ago, she had never imagined she would be standing here today, addressing the very people who had once turned a blind eye to the injustices within these walls. She had faced countless challenges, moments of doubt, and opposition from those who wanted to keep things as they were. But now, standing at the podium, Angela knew that the journey she had started was far from over. It was only just beginning. With a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Angela looked out at the crowd, seeing faces filled with curiosity, some with skepticism, and others with newfound hope. She had earned her place in this room, but she knew it had taken more than just determination. It had taken every ounce of strength she had to bring about the changes she had fought so hard for. A year ago, Angela began, her voice steady and clear. I thought about giving up. There were days when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear, when the resistance was overwhelming, and when I questioned whether I could continue fighting. But today, I stand before you to say that we can change. We must change, and the only thing standing in our way is whether or not we have the courage to speak up, to stand together, and to fight for what is right. Her words echoed in the room, resonating with those who had been silently supporting her all along. as well as with those who had once doubted her. Angela's eyes scanned the room, and she could feel the shift in the energy. There was a new understanding in the air, a recognition that the work she had started was not just about diversity and inclusion, but about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their background or status, could thrive. Change is never easy, she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. It requires us to challenge the status quo, to confront our own biases, and to look beyond what is comfortable. But change is possible because we have already done it. We've created a hospital where fairness, respect, and dignity are not just buzzwords. They are the foundation of everything we do. And this is just the beginning. The journey ahead will not be without its challenges, but I know we are ready to face them. Angela paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, but there was a palpable sense of unity in the air, a collective recognition that despite the difficulties, they had come a long way. "We are stronger together," Angela said, her voice filled with hope. "And if we can do this here at St. Mary's, then we can do this everywhere. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if we continue to speak up, to stand firm, and to support one another, then we will build a future where equality and justice are not just ideals, they are realities." The applause that followed was loud and heartfelt. Some of her colleagues who had once been wary of her methods were now standing and clapping, their faces filled with pride. Others who had been more supportive from the beginning looked at her with admiration. Angela knew that this was more than just a victory for herself. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And as the applause echoed through the auditorium, she realized that this was only the first step in a much larger journey. 1 year ago, Angela had felt lost, but now she stood as a leader, a symbol of the change that was possible when you had the courage to speak the truth. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. She was no longer just fighting for her place at the table. She was fighting for the future of St. Mary's and for the future of healthcare itself. As she stepped away from the podium, Angela felt a sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do, but more importantly, she knew that the real work was just beginning. And with the support of everyone in that room, she was confident that together, they could build something better, something lasting. This is just the beginning, Angela thought as she looked out at the faces before her. And I'm ready to lead us to where we need to go. If you are inspired by stories with unexpected twists, moral challenges, and the impact of kindness, please support us by liking or subscribing to Emotional Journey. We put our heart and soul into each story, and it really means a lot to have you come along for the ride. Thank you for being a part of this journey.